Have you ever just wondered, why are some countries so incredibly rich while others are just trapped in poverty? The gap between them is huge, and today, in this explainer, we're diving into a really powerful answer from the book Why Nations Fail. It puts forward one fundamental reason for this global divide, and trust me, it's probably not what you're thinking. Okay, to really get this, let's start with a tale of one city that's literally split in two by a fence. Nogales. On the U.S. side, in Arizona, the average household pulls in about $30,000 a year. People are healthier, better educated, and life is generally safe. But you go just a few feet south, across that fence, into Mexico, and everything changes. Income is a third of what it is on the other side, life expectancy is lower, and crime is so high that just going about your day can be dangerous. So, same people, same location. What on earth is going on here?
Right, so what could possibly explain this? The people, the climate, the geography, it's all basically identical. The only thing that's really different is that man-made fence. So how can a simple fence separate prosperity from poverty? Let's figure this out.
To get to the real answer, we first have to knock down a few of the usual suspects, some popular theories that you hear all the time, but that just don't hold up to scrutiny. First up, the geography hypothesis. You know this one. It's the idea that rich countries are just, well, lucky. Maybe they were blessed with better weather, more fertile land, or fewer nasty diseases. Yeah, but our example of Nogales pretty much blows that theory right out of the water, doesn't it? The geography is exactly the same on both sides of that fence. The only thing that changes is the economic outcome. So, nope, it's not geography.
Okay, fine. So if it's not geography, what about culture? This is another big one. The theory that maybe some cultures, their values or their work ethic are just inherently better for achieving economic success.
But this one fails too. The people living in Nogales, on both sides, share a very similar culture and heritage. And if you want an even more dramatic example, just look at North and South Korea. We're talking about a people who share thousands of years of the same history and culture, but their economic fates could not be more different. Culture is not destiny.
And this is a really key insight from the book. The authors argue that we often get this completely backwards. Cultural traits, like, say, low levels of trust in a society, don't cause poverty, they're the results of it. Think about it. If you live in a place where you can't trust the courts or the police to protect you and your property, you naturally learn not to trust anyone. It's not a cultural flaw, it's a completely rational response to living inside a broken system.
All right, so last theory to debunk, the ignorance hypothesis. This is the idea that leaders of poor countries are poor simply because they don't know the right policies to make their countries rich. Are they just ignorant? This theory doesn't work because it makes a really big assumption that all rulers want to make their country rich. But a lot of the time, they're more concerned with making themselves rich. Policies that are terrible for a country's economy can actually be fantastic politics for an elite group that wants to stay in power. So it's not ignorance at all. It's a very calculated choice. So if it's not geography, not culture, and not ignorance, what in the world is it? Well, here's the book's central argument. The answer lies in a nation's institutions. In other words, it's all about the rules of the game. So what do we mean by economic institutions? They're basically the rules that shape our incentives. Rules about things like, can you own property securely? Can you start a new business without paying a million bribes? Can you get an education? These rules determine whether it makes sense for you to save, to invest, to innovate, or to get more skills. The book basically splits these rules into two big categories. On the one side, you have inclusive institutions. These are the rules that secure property rights for everybody, create a fair legal system, and let new businesses pop up and compete. They create a level playing field. Then you have the opposite, extractive institutions. These are designed by an elite, for an elite, with the whole point being to extract wealth and resources from the rest of the population for themselves. See, inclusive institutions unleash this powerful engine of prosperity called creative destruction. That's the constant process of new ideas and new technologies replacing old ones. It's what drives progress. But here's the thing. This process is inherently destabilizing. It threatens existing businesses and, more importantly, existing power structures. And that is exactly why elites in extractive systems are terrified of it. Innovation is a direct threat to their power and their profits, so they'll do whatever they can to stop it in its tracks.
So, how did different parts of the world end up with such different sets of rules? The book argues that these paths diverged centuries ago, and the history of colonial America is a perfect case study.
So check this out. When the Spanish arrived in Latin America, they found large, settled native populations and tons of silver and gold. They immediately set up extractive institutions, forced labor systems to plunder all that wealth. But when the English got to North America, they found a different situation. No easy riches, and they couldn't just enslave the sparse population. To get anyone to come over and build a colony, they had to offer real incentives, like giving them their own land and, crucially, a say in their own government. Right from the start, two totally different models were born.
This quote from Captain John Smith just says it all perfectly. He's begging his patrons back in England, please don't just send us 1,000 useless adventurers. Send us 30 skilled people who can actually build a society. They quickly realized they couldn't just loot. They had to create. And to do that, they had to give people incentives. This was the fork in the road that started North America down the path toward inclusive institutions. Now, the tricky thing is, once these institutional patterns are set, they tend to create powerful feedback loops. Extractive institutions in particular generate a vicious circle that is incredibly difficult to break. But, and this is key, it's not impossible. So, here's how that vicious circle works. First, a narrow elite grabs all the political power. Then, they use that power to design economic rules that funnel all the country's wealth to them. As they get richer, they use that money to solidify their power, crushing any rivals and making sure nobody can challenge them. The loop just reinforces itself, over and over, trapping the country in poverty. Now, a country with extractive institutions can grow, at least for a while. A great example is the Soviet Union, which had rapid growth for decades by just forcing all its resources into heavy industry. But that kind of growth isn't sustainable. Because it lacks real innovation, that engine of creative destruction, it eventually just hits a wall and stagnates. So how do you break the cycle? Well, it usually takes a kind of perfect storm. You need a critical juncture, a massive event like a plague or a revolution that shakes everything up. Then, how a country responds depends on small institutional differences that were already there. And finally, you need a broad coalition of people, not just a few rebels, but a wide swath of society empowered enough to demand and fight for real change. The Black Death is the perfect historical example of this. The plague was a huge critical juncture that created a massive labor shortage all across Europe. In Western Europe, where peasants already had some small freedoms, they were able to use that new leverage to demand more rights and better wages. But in Eastern Europe, where the lords were already much stronger, they just doubled down. They used their power to force peasants into an even harsher system called the Second Serfdom. So, same crisis, totally different outcomes, all because of those small initial differences in power. And this all leads to the book's most important message. Prosperity is not an accident of geography. It's not determined by culture. It is not inevitable. Prosperity is chosen. It's the direct result of the political choices a society makes about the rules that will govern it. So we end on this final, crucial question. If prosperity is a choice, then the real struggle is fundamentally a political one. It's the challenge of how an entire society can organize itself to make that choice not just for a privileged few, but for everyone. What does it take to build a political coalition that is broad enough and powerful enough to demand and then protect inclusive institutions? Answering that, well, that's the challenge that really separates the wealth and poverty of nations.